Welcome to the ChinaPower Podcast. I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode, we'll be discussing the new book, Narratives of Sino-Middle Eastern Futures in the Eye of the Beholder. How does focusing on narratives rather than just material power change our understanding of China and the Middle East? How are elites in China, Saudi Arabia, and Syria imagining Beijing's place in the region? Looking ahead, what scenarios might define the future of Sino-Middle Eastern relations, and what should the United States do as multipolarity becomes the regional norm? To explore these questions and more, we are joined by Dr. Mohammed Alsudairi and Dr. Andrea Ghiselli, authors of Narratives of Sino-Middle Eastern Futures. Dr. Alsudairi is a lecturer in politics and international relations of the Arab-speaking world Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. Prior to his appointment, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong, working on a project examining the intersections between religion and infrastructure in the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2015, he oversaw the development of the Asian Studies program at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. More recently, in 2022, he was awarded a research fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to work on his upcoming book manuscript. Dr. Ghiselli is a lecturer in international politics in the Department of Social and Political Sciences, Philosophy, and Anthropology of the University of Exeter. He's also a non-resident research fellow with the Two China Hub and the head of research for its China Med project. He has previously worked in China at Fudan University for 9 years. Mohammed and Andrea, thank you for joining me to discuss your new book, Narratives of Sino-Middle Eastern Futures.
Thank you so much for having us, Bonnie.
So let's start with the first question of what made you write this book and what are some of your main takeaways?
Essentially, we're a bit disappointed in a way with the existing literature and debate, both at the scholarly and policy level, really, about China's role in the Middle East. Especially, we found it essentially was a debate composed of very different views, none of which really took into account how regional actors and the Chinese themselves talked about this relationship. And so we thought that it would be great, since we've been looking at this topic for a very long time, to try to join this debate and drawing on our linguistic skills and again our experience. And that's pretty much how this book was born.
I would add to that, if you look at the existing debate on China's presence in the Middle East for the past few decades, I mean, even one arguably could say since the 90s, there's always been this implicit assumption looking at, certain data points of China's growing material presence there, that China was inevitably going to contest the US, right? And it was going to supersede the US in some way or form. And this is something that is really implicit on many different scales, in the academic discussions, in the policy-oriented discussions, and also in the media coverage. Even now, you can sense it in terms of whatever China does, in terms of rhetorical moves or actions in the region, or the absence of such moves, are always interpreted through the prism of kind of a US-China rivalry, which we're not kind of denying the reality of, but we're also saying that it's important to take into consideration other vantage points that are interpreting this competition from a totally different angle. And as Andrea had mentioned, the local in terms of regional actors and elites, and also just simply how Beijing reads its presence in the Middle East. And that's kind of what we aimed to do with this book, because, you do sometimes hear people say, well, we've kind of moved beyond the China-US great power rivalry prism when it comes to analyzing their engagement in the Middle East. But I don't actually think that's true at all. I still can see there is this kind of prevailing assumption that China wants to come and reshape the region in its own image. And what we wanted to do with this book was to kind of counter that and show a much more complicated picture.
And in terms of showing a much more complicated picture, what would you highlight as maybe one or two perspectives you're seeing from regional countries? I know we'll get to this in a lot more detail later, but if you could just preview some of your key findings early here, that'd be super helpful.
I would say very kind of briefly that regional actors see that this is a moment in kind of the global order where there are transitions taking place, and we're moving from kind of a unipolar towards a multipolar order. And they see China as playing an important role in that context. But what's interesting is that these regional actors, wherever they position themselves ideologically, vis-a-vis the United States, whether they're antagonistic or pro-US, regardless of their national capabilities, what we see is a vision of the regional future that doesn't necessarily see China as playing a role equivalent to that of the US, whether as something to be aspired for or something to be actively pursued. And I think that's kind of one of the key takeaways of the book is that, looking at the local towards this kind of US-China rivalry, it isn't necessarily, the US is leaving, let's pave the way for China's entry. I mean, this is kind of maybe one key takeaway. I don't know if, Andrea, you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, I would just add that I agree with all of that, but also that oftentimes these countries do not really look just at China and the US. For example, in the case of Syria, this comes up in the chapter in our book about that. There's also Russia, for example. For the Saudis also, there is not just China and the US, there are other actors in the region or outside that are important for the Saudis in this case to achieve their own goals domestically or in foreign policy. But this is often missed in the debate, I believe.
Great, thank you. And I think this relates to what your book opens with, which is the idea of a post-American Middle East. As you were saying, Mohammed, like moving from a unipolar to a multipolar order. Could you share a little bit about what regional countries are seeing as this post-American Middle East, and also how China views this idea of a post-American Middle East?
Well, I think when it comes to the perception of a post-American Middle East, it's really rooted in how local actors have perceived signals from the United States over the past 15 years. Because what you've seen is a succession of US administrations, beginning with the Obama administration, really, of signaling a desire for a pivot. I mean, that was the big kind of keyword for the past decade. It's kind of receded now. But, kind of the idea of the US moving or extracting itself from the Middle East to focus more on the Asia Pacific. And that kind of strategy has resurfaced in different forms, right? In the past few years, if you think of, say, the Biden administration's push for the Abrahamic Accords as a continuation of the first Trump administration's work, and the idea being that by facilitating Israel's integration into the region and creating kind of a common security economic complex, the US can then move away from a region that has often given it headaches and problems to focus on a more important theater in the East. But this signaling of a desire of the US to extract itself has been interpreted particularly by regional actors in the Arabian Peninsula, right? The wealthy states that comprise the Gulf Cooperation Council as kind of the beginnings of US abandonment. And these kind of signals were, I would say, complicated further by the fact that the US hasn't really committed to the security of those countries at certain pivotal moments, right? So there was the attack in 2019 where drones had kind of put out a considerable amount of Saudi oil production capacity in 2019. And the US's non-response to that was really interpreted as the absence of US commitment to these countries and their security, right? Particularly Saudi Arabia. And we have other kind of major events in the succeeding years that have fed into what I would argue is a crisis of trust between, for example, long-standing security partners of the US in the region, like in 2022, when it comes to the UAE, and even most recently with the Doha attack by Israel on Qatar, right? I would say that for a lot of these actors, this is a moment where we're seeing kind of a change in the global balance of power, and it's also being informed by a perception that the US is no longer really committed to their security, as was, say, the case in the 90s and the early 2000s, right? This is a different moment, really, and it's a moment laden with many possibilities. So you could think about, and we can talk about this later maybe in the podcast, of how Saudi Arabia entered into a defense agreement with Pakistan very recently as a consequence of, or a byproduct of, this crisis of trust. And that is all part of the story of the region's entry into a post-American phase.
Yeah, if I can jump in on the China side, I think the Chinese have always been a bit more ambivalent. I think for a while they've been describing instability in the Middle East as the byproduct of the arrival of the post-America Middle East. But I don't think they've ever really thought that this is already a post-America Middle East. I think there was this idea that, of course, the United States is less committed to regional order, or at least to the previous type of regional order, and this is causing instability in a way or the other through interventionism and so far and so on. But if one goes beyond the media, like beyond the Global Times and People's Daily, our reading of what Chinese experts have been writing over the past decade or so is that essentially none of them believe that there is a greater power than the United States in the region. They all say, militarily speaking, the United States is uncontested, economically, culturally, it still is the main power in the region. As a matter of fact, there was the impression that, the United States was trying to pivot away. This was not really going to change its dominant position in the region. If anything, first under Biden, there was the fear of a kind of Middle East, Indo-Pacific containment of China. So the Middle East remaining an important, or maybe even being integrated in this pivot really away from the region. And I remember reading some of the comments in the aftermath of the American bombing of Iran during the 12-day war, and of course also as reaction to the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. Some prominent Chinese experts were saying now, more than ever probably, or at least more than ever in comparison with the past few years, the United States is in a truly dominant position, also thanks to Israel, but the United States is truly in a dominant position. And I believe in this context, the fall of Assad was particularly important as, well, it definitely weakened significantly both Iran and especially Russia there, leaving essentially the United States as the only truly extra-regional great power still active there.
So as we look at a region in which regional actors like Saudi Arabia are thinking beyond just their relationship with the United States, as you mentioned, looking at defense agreements with Pakistan, forming other relationships, and as we look at China, that is looking at the Middle East and viewing the United States as becoming even more powerful than before, how are Chinese elites framing their approach to the region? Do they still view their approach to the region as one of economic opportunity? Is there also more of a security opportunity, or is there more of a security liability? How do they view the region in terms of their overall global strategy?
So I think if we talk about the region in the context of China's global strategy, I think it makes sense. I love describing it in a way that is like one of the most important among the least important regions for China, in the sense that Chinese scholars and experts, of course, recognize that the region is important for a number of reasons, like oil. Of course, there's the issue of the Uyghurs. There's the fact that in a way or the other, what happens in the Middle East usually ends up at the Security Council, which of course is a cornerstone, or at least one of the key platforms for Chinese diplomacy at the global level, where it kind of tries to shape the debate around issues such as sovereignty and intervention. That said, looking a bit more specific at how the past years China has been looking at the region and looking at its own strategy, its own policy toward the region, there's been a lot of debate, but I believe there's no real consensus. And especially after October 7, I think whatever minimum consensus that existed has disappeared. But until then, I think there was this idea that China should do more. But it seems the Chinese experts were not really able of really spelling out what something else is. There was no appetite for developing any regional partnership to as something into a relationship like the one that the United States has with Israel. There was no real appetite for military intervention. And so at the end of the day, there was essentially many were saying we should do more, but we're not really sure what we should do. Even toward the United States, it seemed that some wanted a more confrontational policy, others were against, especially fearful that this could backfire significantly. And again, in a region in which China does not have as vital interest as they still are, of course, in East Asia. And of course, there was a lot of uncertainty about what could happen in the region. Even years after the Arab Spring, there was a lot of distrust toward the strategies, domestic strategies adopted by many regional actors, with the exception of probably Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and in general Gulf countries, which are trying, right, to diversify their economy and move beyond being just oil producers. And so this was seen very positively by China, but we're talking about a very specific part of the region, right? The rest was much more uncertain.
Thank you. I also wanted to talk about how the region is viewing China's role, but as the two of you mentioned, it's a very diverse region, so it might be useful before we have that conversation to focus on the two countries and cases in your book, which was Saudi Arabia and Syria under Assad. Mohammed, could you give us a quick description of why you selected these two countries and how these two countries generally view China?
I think the logic that animated our selection is that we wanted to focus on countries that were quite different along two scales. The first scale being their positionality vis-a-vis the US, right? So Saudi Arabia has a very old strategic relationship with the United States that goes back to at least 7 or 8 decades, has always been kind of intertwined with the US security and economic system in many, many different ways. While in the case of, say, Ba'athist Syria, and its situation is more akin to that of Iran and other actors, is one that for many decades has ideologically and politically positioned itself in opposition to the US. And you can see these kind of ideological campus differences very clearly when it comes to the events of, say, the 2010s when the Arab Spring had erupted. I mean, of course, these precede the Arab Spring, but they became very obvious as fault points during that time where Saudi Arabia, as well as kind of the other Gulf monarchies, as well as Jordan and Egypt, kind of clustered themselves as a grouping that represented the moderate camp in the region, while Syria aligned itself with actors such as Iran, sub-state actors such as Hezbollah, some of the movements in Iraq, and all kind of fashioned themselves as a cluster that was opposed to US and Israeli hegemony in the region. And they often called themselves the axis of resistance that had been particularly targeted by Israel after the October 7th attacks, right? In kind of a quick succession, beginning with Hezbollah and of course culminating with Iran. Now, that's one scale where we wanted to kind of gauge the narratives that exist among elites that envision the world in very different ways, ideologically speaking, but could be considered representative of other narratives and discussions in the region along this kind of ideological spectrum. And the other scale is that we chose them because they represented countries with very distinct and different national capabilities. I mean, Saudi Arabia is one of the wealthiest economies in the region, 1.3 trillion in terms of its GDP. It's one of the G20 economies, very technologically robust, undergoing industrialization, and therefore a country with a lot of weight, both regionally and globally. And that kind of gives it a lot more leeway. While Syria, at least for the temporal period we were looking at, from 2010 to 2023, was a country that was essentially devastated by its civil war. I mean, half the population of Syria had been displaced. The economy dwindled from something in around 60 billion US to hovering right now to around 20 billion. We're talking about a country that had been completely gutted when it comes to its infrastructure, in terms of its human capacities. But there's also kind of this big gap between them in terms of their material realities and how that kind of could potentially shape their approaches to the great powers. We chose these two countries because we felt that they could capture a snippet of kind of the diversity of regional debates and allow us to kind of create a mental map or an entry point really into creating a much larger mental map of how regional elites think about China.
Thank you. I want to now turn to what we're seeing in terms of regional views from both Saudi as well as Syria. So, Mohammed, one of the things that you mentioned in the book was how Saudi elites see the US as their indispensable security partner and China as their economic partner. How does Saudi Arabia reconcile this dual dependence? And how sustainable is this, in some ways, division of labor between the United States and China in the long run?
I mean, I think for them, the issue is not that they see that there is this division of labor, as it were. I mean, they're not particularly concerned with the China variable. They're more concerned with the American variable when it comes to national security. I mean, I mentioned earlier that there is kind of this growing crisis of trust that had been building up for the past 15 years, and arguably also has its roots even in the early 2000s after the 9/11 attacks and kind of the strains that occurred because of the American invasion of Iraq. But those were not as serious as kind of the lack of commitment and intervention by a succession of US administrations, some of which were perceived to be particularly close to Saudi Arabia and even the wider Gulf regimes. I mean, if you think of, say, the first Trump administration, the 2019 attack happened under their watch. So for the Saudis, if we were going back to kind of the earlier point about regional elites recognizing that this is a moment of flux and change and we're moving from a unipolar to a multipolar moment, I think generally regional elites across the region, despite their ideological positioning, still see the United States as the premier and even hegemonic military and technological power. This is changing in many different ways, but they also see it as a power that is in the process of moving out of the region or re-entrenching and redeploying elsewhere, right? Despite even kind of the instances of intervention we've seen across the past year. So their assessment now is, at least thinking about it from the perspective of Saudi elites, is how do we arrest this process of American departure from the region and ensure or capture their continued commitment towards our security? And I think one approach was to kind of pursue potentially a security treaty with the United States. I mean, the argument was we could sign a mutual defense treaty similar to the ones that Taiwan or Japan had signed in the 1950s, and to try to kind of get ironclad guarantees, right? And there was a lot of debate about whether this would be tied with normalization to Israel, concessions on the Saudi nuclear program, etc. But it seems to me that the asks have been too high, and the various hurdles, congressional and what have you, were too great, that the idea of reaching a formalized defense treaty between Saudi Arabia and the US is no longer quite tenable. So I think the Saudi assessment now looking ahead is not necessarily to pivot to China, because China is their most important economic partner. I mean, I don't think they see that as a tenable or possible option for different reasons, and also potentially because the Chinese don't have that appetite, as our book kind of highlights and shows, but rather they kind of are trying to use a different set of instruments to resolve their national security predicament. And that would include trying to develop indigenous defensive industrial capacity, trying to diversify their weapon imports, right? To kind of avoid the US kill switch, to avoid the glaring gaps in capability that would emerge when dealing with one particular actor, say Israel, which was very obvious after the Israeli attack on Doha, trying to build different types of security partnerships, as was the case with Pakistan, while still trying to maintain a close relationship with the US, right? So the US is no longer that dependable, but the US remains too important to dispense with. So you build kind of enough room to maneuver while maintaining this relationship until you are sufficiently independent or autonomous to be able to delink. And I think other actors in the region who are closely aligned with the US are thinking along those lines, but perhaps, pursuing a different assortment of strategies depending on their national capabilities, right? But that's kind of the general picture when it comes to the Saudis dealing with this quandary.
And are you seeing any cases or examples in which Saudi Arabia is using the China card, or I guess the recognition that US-China competition is quite central to DC policy, to extract concessions or to get Washington to focus more on Saudi Arabia?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not just in the case of Saudi, I think many other regional actors are deploying the China card in many different ways, including, for example, the United Arab Emirates. But the way they're using it is not just when it comes to, say, armaments, right? I mean, they would point to the US. If you don't sell us the best grades of weaponry, we can turn to China, or we have other options. We're seeing this when it comes to the technological realm, particularly now when it comes to, say, the highly efficient and effective NVIDIA chips, right? I mean, one could argue that the sets of concessions made to these countries, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, is very much intimately tied with the US-China AI race. And the stakeholders in the Gulf in conjunction with kind of like-minded elites in Silicon Valley, have really successfully managed to push this, right? And this is not, of course, something that is there in a black box. I mean, the elites in the Gulf are actively signaling this and communicating this when they interact with the Western press. Now, obviously, this is to an intended audience, but that is really how you use the China card, right? There's a lot of different interviews involving the Crown Prince with The Atlantic, as well as other outlets, where he clearly makes these statements, right? Where if the US doesn't necessarily provide certain concessions on certain matters, they have the China option, right? It provides them with strategic leeway and room to maneuver. Now, this is not necessarily new. I mean, you could even actually trace it back to the 1980s when Saudi Arabia purchased the Dongfang missiles, for example, when the US administration at the time was refusing to provide armament exports to Saudi Arabia. But this is kind of not a necessarily new dynamic by any means, but it's becoming much more intense because of the sensitivity of Washington to China's growing presence in many parts of the world. I mean, in many ways, it actually validates that classic book, The Vital Triangle between China, the Middle East, and the US. I believe it's John Alterman and a co-author.
And this seems to relate to the point that the two of you are emphasizing, which is there are exaggerated perceptions of China's both ties as well as capabilities in the region. And Mohammed, what you're saying seems to suggest that regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, might be exaggerating the extent they want to partner with China in order to keep the United States engaged.
Yeah, sure. There's definitely, and this was especially the case, for example, when we start to look at the Syrian case. Syrian state media were incredibly active in really pushing this idea that China was not an ally, because they don't use this term, especially in the Arabic version of their articles, but definitely a very close and strong partner. Not on par with, let's say, Iran or Russia, for example, but really in the background, ready to lend a hand, especially once the war would have been over and the Assad regime would be in power again and would be busy with the reconstruction. Of course, that didn't happen, but it was this idea that China is there, is ready to provide some help. It has already done so at the Security Council and will increasingly do more so later on. And it was very interesting to see that this was something present both in Arabic language media, which of course were for domestic and regional audience, but also in the English articles published by SANA, the Syrian state news agency. However, very interestingly, something that we noted, and we don't really have a good explanation for it, it was very interesting to notice that Syrian media actually did not talk about the Chinese military delegation that visited the country a few years ago. There's really no talk about that in Syrian media, which was quite interesting. But nonetheless, there was really an attempt, it was quite evident that the Assad regime was trying a way to play the China card, if you want to use this expression, to strengthen its legitimacy at home, to show like, look, we are treated as partners on equal footing by the new soon-to-be superpower, maybe the soon-to-be only superpower in the world, right? As soon as the Americans will finally fall. So this was for domestic audience, but I believe also for international audiences, they really wanted to show they're not isolated and that China had their back.
And how have you seen this discourse change in the post-Assad Syria?
I mean, I think it's still early to make an assessment about how Syrian-Chinese relations will look like. But I think there has been kind of a dramatic shift, right? This is a new order and regime that doesn't necessarily
Use the same instruments as its Ba'ath predecessor. It's a state that wants to kind of reset its diplomatic slate and the types of engagement it has. I mean, it's actively engaging Western countries. It's re-engaging regional states that traditionally the Syrian state prior to 2024 was in a hostile relationship with, including many of those in the Gulf, although there was kind of a slow process of renormalizing and reintegrating it into the regional system. But it's very obvious that this new regime is very eager to establish ties with China. I mean, it's already engaging with Russia, even though Russia was an active ally of the regime that they had overthrown. I mean, it's worth noting that President Ahmed al is going to the Russian summit in Moscow. So they're really trying to renormalize and re-engage. But the issue now with China is that there are a sets of files that haven't been completely addressed. And the primary file really relates to the presence of Uyghur foreign fighters who were in the rebel ranks and had now been integrated into the newly established Syrian Arab army. And so there's a lot of, I would say, differences of opinion between Beijing and Damascus over it. I mean, there's also security concerns. It's worth noting that the Chinese ambassador to Damascus isn't there physically. He's actually in Beirut. But it seems to me that there has been certain breakthroughs that have happened in terms of the discussions between both sides, at least from where I'm standing, if only because the very fact that the new Syrian president was able to give his address to the General Assembly a few weeks ago is, I would say, indicative of the fact that China was no longer trying to obstruct his participation. This was kind of the fear in the lead up to that event. I expect that ultimately pragmatism will prevail, and we will probably see kind of some normalization between Syria and China, and in fact, potentially a rebound of economic ties between these two countries that were essentially non-existent during the Assad period and the time of the civil war. I mean, in fact, what we will probably see, or what I anticipate seeing, I don't know if Andrea, you agree with me, is that Syria will probably align more with kind of the regional norm in some ways, economically, diplomatically, than what had prevailed in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, absolutely. I think that would be a very fair assessment of the situation. I remember reading this notice that was published on WeChat by the Syrian embassy, I think last year, or I believe last year. And they were saying all the right things, essentially. We want peace, we want to cooperate with China for prosperity, regional peace, fight against terrorism. There was no hint at some kind of blaming China for having previously supported the Assad regime. I think the Syrians have been extremely smart in putting all of that aside. After all, China is a bit of an indispensable country. It clearly showed that in the case of Iran, it is not going to come to save you when you're bombed, but at the same time, it remains a permanent member of the Security Council. If you need investment, reconstruction, building infrastructure and so on, China is your main interlocutor. And so, yeah, as soon as Mohammed said, pragmatism will prevail, it's likely we'll see some kind of rebound in Chinese. But I don't expect it to be major type of rebound. It will also depend a lot on how the situation in Syria will evolve, especially in terms of safety and also the financial and banking system. We'll see, but I think in the long term, it makes total sense to expect Syria behaving more or less like many of the countries in the region, trying to keep good relations with both the United States and Europe on the one hand and China on the other. I think we will definitely see that happening.
Thank you. I think we've talked quite a bit about how Saudi Arabia looks at China, how Syria engaged with China during Assad as well as the post-Assad period. I'd like to also get your sense of how regional countries are assessing China's diplomacy towards one of the hot button issues right now, which is Iran, particularly how China responded after the June 2024 Israel-Iran war and how China is working with other actors to prevent sanctions on Iran's nuclear program. How are regional actors assessing China's position and diplomacy here?
I would just add a few things on the Iranian point of view. I think it makes sense also to mention how Iran reacted to Chinese action to that. And we at the ChinaMed project, we analyzed the writings of Iranian experts and scholars in the aftermath of the 12-Day War. And it's quite interesting. There was a lot of, you can say, self-blaming, really. It was clear that some expected China to be somewhat more active during the war, but it seems to me most of them, in a way, expected also China really standing aside. And for that, interestingly, they ended up mostly blaming their government for not giving good enough reasons to China to intervene. And so it's a bit difficult to tell really how this will shape Sino-Iranian relations in the future, really. Well, also because in any case, Iran remains so isolated, there is no European option whatsoever to kind of carry out a East and West type of diplomacy. And so probably see renewed push, at least in Iran, to strengthen relations with China, despite Chinese, I can say, inaction during the war. But nonetheless, it's clear that most likely will increase Iranian dependency on China. It will probably also make China a bit more uneasy about this growing Iranian dependency on it, which is something that I believe the Chinese do not want. That's also why they've been so supportive of the idea of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. They want to see Iran more integrated in the region so that it's also less reliant on China, I believe. We will see.
I think what I'll just add very quickly is one, if we look at the kind of the Arab media ecosystem, I would say that there are some similar echoes to what Andrea had mentioned with regards to reactions, in the sense that the vast majority probably did not register any surprise. And in fact, China was largely invisible in these debates and discussions. But there is also in the ecosystems that are closer to, I would say, axis of resistance aligned views, namely Arab audiences that were sympathetic to Iran and its regional project, did kind of register some surprise. This is kind of at one level in terms of the reactions to China's non-reaction with regards to that war. But in terms of China's position when it comes to, say, resisting the reimposition of sanctions on Iran, I think this is not something that is necessarily opposed in different parts of the region, including particularly the Gulf, because it's worth remembering that the Gulf or the GCC states, their positions on Iran have evolved since the 2010s. Once upon a time in the mid-2010s, they took a particularly hard view where they even opposed the JCPOA agreement because they saw that it was insufficient in addressing Iran's wider stance in the region. But now, especially over the past few years, and as a consequence of the crisis of trust with the United States, they have made an assessment, most notably Saudi Arabia, but I think it's also applicable to many of the other actors, including the UAE, Kuwait, etc., that it's better to achieve a détente with Iran and kind of facilitate Iran's slow reintegration into the region as a way to reshape and resocialize its behavior. So I don't think they necessarily view the Chinese stance of opposing the reimposition of sanctions as problematic. In fact, they probably welcome it in certain quarters. And I mean, just putting it in even a broader context, the main contradiction in the region over the past 15, even one could argue 20 years, and this is something we tried to highlight in the book, has really been Iran, right? Although other kind of local regional actors from an Arab perspective would also maybe add Israel and Turkey. And this was kind of a result of the fact that the region, because of the Arab Spring and before it, the American invasion of Iraq, had really led to a situation where state authority had collapsed and there was a vacuum being filled by these various different actors. And I think now, especially looking at the events from October 7th onwards, kind of the past 2 years, what we see is a region that is increasingly now seeing Israel as the primary contradiction as opposed to Iran, right? And that we see kind of this bid on the part of the Israeli leadership to try to impose kind of an Israeli hegemony over the wider Middle East. And this is something that is also now shaping assessments and reorienting a lot of actors away from Iran as a threat source towards Israel. This doesn't mean, of course, that Iran is completely invisible from their threat horizons, but that now the main focus is really towards Tel Aviv as opposed to Tehran.
Does that have implications for how they think about their relations to China or no?
It's a very interesting question. I think what will happen is that the recent events over the past year or 2 years is really kind of forcing a lot of different elites to think about kind of US security guarantees and commitments towards them if Israel is included as a variable in these assessments. So, I mean, the whole saga with Qatar was a very interesting, I would say, event. And we haven't really fully internalized the complications of that event. Trump has come in and made an executive announcement that the United States sees Qatar as its primary security partner in the region, or one of its primary security partners, and that any attack on Qatari security is an attack on US security, etc. But this is kind of something that is really contingent to the Trump administration. And it might very well be worth the paper it's written on, right? It's valueless over the long durée. So I think for local actors, the lessons they will draw from all of this is that you need to kind of begin to build up strategic capacity to really protect yourself under conditions where the US might give Israel free rein to strike against you, despite, your close alignment with the United States and your presumed status as a security partner. Now, where does China fit in? This might lead to a reassessment or rethinking when it comes to the procurement of Chinese arms. Now, there's a lot of challenges and impediments to doing that kind of shift, right? Politically, the US may come in and really put a halt to such importations. There's also a lot of kind of hardware issues where your weapon systems and hardware depend on, US supplies, US support, maintenance. There's also, of course, the whole issue of a kill switch. But countries can find alternative solutions to that over the long term, right? They can build stockpiles slowly, they can procure hardware in different ways, and they can actually find innovative solutions. So for instance, the Pakistani military now is really one of the few militaries that I can think of that has done a big shift from US hardware to Chinese hardware. Certain categories of the equipment have performed well, especially when it came to the May engagement with India. And you could see a scenario where if down the line there was issues when it comes to Saudi Arabia's security, they would ask, for instance, the Pakistanis to deploy their air defense systems on Saudi soil, all of which are Chinese made. And this would avoid kind of a lot of the political complications that would arise from procuring such air defense systems directly from China. And they would close kind of the capabilities gap. I'm just thinking creatively here, and I'm not necessarily saying that this isn't where things are headed, but I think we are at an inflection point where there are a lot of interesting now kind of strategic options being opened. And I think, for us, at least in terms of this book, the point isn't necessarily that China is coming to replace the US and play the same game, right? But it's rather that China offers alternatives and creates options that did not exist before. And this creates a lot more room for strategic maneuvering for regional actors, especially if they're smart enough to capitalize on said opportunities.
If I may jump in on this, I think this also leads to another question, that is, will the Chinese actually be willing to provide those opportunities, right? I think from weapons to all the rest. I think when it comes to chips and tech, I think the answer is absolutely yes. When it comes to weapons, I'm not sure. I think it will also require people in Beijing to really think hard about where this will put them in relations with the United States, but also in terms of possible new types of entanglement in a region in which they've been quite clear they don't want to be entangled in. I think we will have to see. It also depends a lot on the dynamics of Chinese policy making and how much this issue will be able to reach really the leadership, because probably that's what will be required for any real breakthrough on the Chinese side.
Doesn't China already provide significant weapons to Saudi Arabia?
I think what Mohammed was alluding at was really Pakistan-style kind of transformation in terms of moving really toward China-built or China structure, you can say, types of armed forces in the region, not just a few pieces here and there. I think this was the option list. For example, I go back to what I was saying earlier about Iran. There was this interview with a former Iranian ambassador in China saying, essentially, we missed the opportunity years ago to buy Chinese weapons. They tried to buy from Russia. And then the ambassador was saying, now it will take time because such kind of transformation and reorganization of the armed forces requires truly radical changes. And Iran, in a way, is in a position to do that if the Chinese allow that to happen, because there's no more Iranian Air Force, for example. But when it comes to other regional players, I think there is a lot to be done. There's a lot to be changed, a lot to be reconstructed. And so it should be considered this kind of inertia, both on the regional partner side and also on the Chinese side, how much they're willing to go.
Right. So in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up by asking you to look at the future of the Middle East, particularly Sino-Middle Eastern relations. So in the book, you highlight three possible scenarios: what you call cautious continuity, deeper Chinese embedding, or more of a discordant uncertainty. Could you briefly describe each scenario and which scenario you think we're most likely to see, at least based on what we know now in terms of the near future?
Right. We outlined those different scenarios in a way that, again, they all reflect different possible combinations of alignment or disalignment between regional players and China, whether both sides agree that China should play a larger role in the region, whether both sides agree that China should not play a larger role in the region, or whether the two sides disagree on this issue. Maybe China would like to play a larger role, but the regional players don't, or vice versa. In my opinion, and then of course, I'm also curious to hear what Mohammed thinks, is that probably the scenario that we believe is most likely, and that we write in the book, that is a general agreement between China and key regional players that China should not play a larger role, is the most likely to continue in the foreseeable future. I look at this from the Chinese side, and we struggle to see how China could, see benefits in something different from what it's doing at the moment. Also, again, regional players, and here probably Mohammed is better positioned than me to talk about that. I also don't think regional players really want to go all in with China. They see the benefits of playing the China card whenever that's possible, and probably they want to preserve those benefits.
I mean, I would agree with that assessment. I think, regional actors, their preference is to exist in a multipolar context where they can maximize their opportunities, secure kind of their strategic autonomy. I mean, certainly some of these regional actors would like to arrest the US departure from the region in order to obtain more resources, to continue maintaining kind of security commitments. But I think many of these actors can see the writing on the wall, and they want to position themselves in an advantageous place, right, for the kind of the next cycle or the next iteration or configuration of the regional order. Now, these countries, I would say, in the case of, say, Saudi Arabia or Syria, post-Assadist Syria, the UAE, Egypt, etc., I think their regional elites, if the status quo is not tenable, their imagination of the regional future is not one that's dominated by China. Their vision of it is one where the regional order is oriented around them and their interests, right? I mean, Riyadh, if a post-American future is inevitable, wants to see a regional order that orients itself around Saudi interests and where Saudi could potentially be the main regional power or actor. At least that's kind of how I see it. I would just add maybe one final point on all of this, right, kind of our assessment about the future. It's very clear that, local actors and as well as Chinese actors, or the people who are involved in the policy debates in Beijing, don't have an appetite to see kind of Chinese embeddedness in the regional order and having it impose kind of a pax sinica. And I think this is also important to underscore because we do suffer, I think, as analysts from something of creative poverty or a poverty in our creative imagination, because we assume that kind of the US departure from the Middle East theater will essentially create a vacuum that will be filled by another great power, right? And that great power will reproduce the same patterns of power as well as pursue the same interests as the US. But the region's position in the global political economy is transforming and changing, especially the energy variable. The global economy itself is being reconfigured due to the rise of automated industrialization and the emergence of new types of technologies. And China's vision maybe of a region of strategic interest, right, or regions of strategic interest beyond its immediate peripheries might be categorically different in the 21st century than they were in the 20th. For example, the moon might have much bigger importance for China as a great power than, say, embedding itself and engaging with the Middle East. Just simply the way in which its interests have been categorically transformed as a result of these various different variables that we've mentioned. When we think of, say, the United States and Great Britain as comparative points and the Americans as successors to the British engagement with the Middle East and its interest in it were vastly different than that of the US. So why should we assume that the Chinese will necessarily be successors to the Americans? And that's kind of one of the key points that we want to push against. And they themselves don't expose any interest in playing that role to begin with, let alone local actors.
So on that note, what are key recommendations the two of you have for the United States as well as our European allies and friends? It seems like one recommendation is don't exaggerate Chinese influence in the Middle East. And per the discussion that we had, both in terms of China's relationship with Syria as well as China's relationship with Iran, it seems like what you're also saying is, however you think about the axis of resistance, the relationship with China is still increasing, but not necessarily that strong.
I think when we think about recommendations for US or European policymakers when it comes to China and the Middle East, maybe I'm too blunt on this. I think in both in Europe and the United States, there's no that much clarity. What's the end goal of the relations with China? And so I think that should be clarified in the very first place. Then when it comes to China and the Middle East, I think China definitely has some interest preferences that are very different from those of the United States and Europe, for example, when it comes to liberal democracy and so far and so on. Although, of course, oftentimes European and American policymakers also have not really cared that much about that issue. But in any case, I think the importance is really not to demonize China or to see it always as a threat. Of course, it cannot always be a partner, but there are definitely certain issues over which it's possible to come to some kind of pragmatic agreement. I think it's important to see China's role as distinct from, let's say, Russia's role in the region. The Chinese themselves perceive themselves as different from Russia in terms of the means and goals that they try to pursue. And I think this is important. I think this is something that should always be kept in mind when trying to formulate any kind of effective policy toward China and in the Middle East.
I fully agree with Andrea's assessments and I echo them. And maybe I would just add the point that applying a great power prism to interpret China's presence in the region is very distortive, right? And it actually occludes or invisibilizes what I would think are really the main issue at hand, which is that the US and the European Union internally have a lot of disarray when it comes to their strategic approaches to the region. I mean, there's a lot of lack of clarity with regards to US security guarantees. There is really kind of a huge moral failing when it comes to these governments' approaches to the Middle East. I mean, Gaza, it's not that the US has ceded the high ground, it is actively occupying the low ground when it comes to this issue. You know, there is a lack of clarity, even forget about kind of their diplomatic approaches, even internally when it comes to their industrial policy, their commitment to technological innovation. And all of these have a cumulative effect of essentially reducing their competitiveness and their ability to provide alternatives, right? So I would say that the main takeaway here is clean up your own house first before getting, too aggravated about the Chinese presence in the Middle East or elsewhere.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mohammed and Andrea, for this very enlightening as well as nuanced conversation about how to think about China's role in the Middle East. As you mentioned, a lot of countries are engaging in China, not necessarily because they want China to replace the United States, but as an alternative, and given all the issues that are characterizing US as well as European engagement to the region. I recommend that listeners take a look at your book, because your book is very in-depth, and we, of course, were not able to cover all the aspects in the book. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Bodley.